Alrighty, so this week is Mental Health Awareness Week. So this seemed like a very appropriately timed one because we'd actually been discussing this one quite a lot recently. So it seemed
Yeah.
the perfect time to do a little Fitbit on it. And
hmm
that is kind of the idea of client psychology, something which I feel isn't touched on a great deal
No.
because whereas I think it's now become a little more sort of understood that people often get themselves in pretty bad shape in terms of their physiology and some of the better coaches out there and now understanding how to prime clients physiologically perhaps there's still a great deal of work to be done. I feel on the psychological side of
Yeah.
things because let's be real, a lot of people are looking to better themselves when they get into sort of fitness and perhaps trying to improve their physique and stuff, and a lot of the times that does come from perhaps not being in the best place upstairs, whether that be from some sort of trauma, endured a while back and sort of the impacts that can have. But I feel like that in itself needs to be addressed quickly because, there is a bit of a difference between mental health and mental illness. So
Mhm.
Ben, I don't know if you want to get started on that because I mean, neither of us are technically, qualified psychologists, but Ben has studied this to a decent level. And I mean, myself as a coach, it is just something important to understand to a level that it can be applied to clients, even if not, studying it at a super high level. So yeah, I'll hand
Yeah.
it over to you. Ready, Ben?
I mean, I'm definitely not a trained psychologist or anything like that, but I have done psychology now up to a master's level. And it's been all the way through the masters as well. So, again, definitely not a trained psychology, but I have somewhat of an understanding to some degree. I mean, admittedly, I don't even think the true psychological experts really know what's going on in the human mind. Like,
Yeah.
it's so messy, it's so complicated. I don't think anyone truly understands. But I think the first thing is to clear up the difference between mental health and mental illness. A lot of people think they're the same thing, they're just on the same scale, whereas they're not at all. So, mental health is the ability to function in everyday life. Mental illness is the state of disorder or disease. So, you can have perfectly good mental health, but have a mental illness such as depression. Or you could have very poor mental health and have no mental illness whatsoever. They're not the same thing. Having one doesn't mean you have the other, or I should say, having one which is bad doesn't mean the other is also bad. Again, Stephen Fry is a great example of that. He's got bipolar disorder, but he functions in everyday life very, very well. So he's got, poor mental, or he's got a mental illness, but very good mental health. So they're not the same thing.
That makes sense, in terms of how we're living and the application that that may have on our ability to work and earn money and live off. If we are trying to pursue some sort of side endeavor, like perhaps something like bodybuilding or trying to better yourself in some way, then I think that the application of these things is massive. So I think the idea of illness versus health that's kind of actually impacting your everyday life is very, very important to touch on. The wording, I totally understand, gets
It's
messed
just
up.
so,
You don't want to make one sound more important than the other.
yeah, it's so,
As you,
it's so tricky
as
to,
you disclaimed, mental illness on the whole still absolutely devastating. But for the purposes of what we're talking about in this video and sort of mental health awareness week and stuff, it's still important to draw that line of we're talking about stuff which is more so having an impact on your everyday life, really, so to speak. The
yeah,
stuff
it is,
the stuff
it's
that's
very,
changing the stuff that's changing your behaviors,
yeah,
and how that's sort of impacting what we're trying to do, because at the end of the day this is a bodybuilding and fitness podcast. So the idea of something sort of changing your personality and behavior and the impact that
yeah.
that might have is important to touch on. We're not
And I've
by any
just
means saying one's worse than the other or anything.
just thought of the importance, actually, the point I was trying to get across. I've just thought of like in a good example of how to make this point. As you can see, it is very tricky to make the wording because I didn't want to accidentally make it sound like I was trying to discard one of them or say it doesn't really matter. Of course it does. So in a good example is, typically you would hear symptoms of depression would be, you can't get out of bed. You stay in bed all day, you have no motivation to do anything. you feel very, very low, something like that. But obviously, if that's the case, then you have a mental illness and poor mental health. Whereas that isn't going to be the case for everyone. Some people will have depression and still function in everyday life. Again, you hear the stories all the time. People, oh God, what's the lead singer of Linkin Park called? Chester. What's his second name?
Bennington.
Yeah, Chester Bennington. That video that the night before he took his life, he was laughing.
Yeah.
So that's the point I'm trying to get across, is that because they're not the same thing, it's not always obvious when someone has a mental illness. And that's why it's important to understand the difference, because then it's easier, or not easier, but you can at least understand that you can't judge someone based on how they're acting, or you can't judge someone and just assume that they're fine when maybe they're not. And I think, again, being able to then recognize the true signs of mental illness versus just poor mental health is going to be key, because then it's going to help you to understand and potentially help that person better. I think that's the kind of the point I was trying to get across, is that, again, because they're not the same thing, then it's not always obvious when someone has a mental illness. So maybe not even obvious when someone has poor mental health either. So again, that's why when we talk about awareness, that's why it's so important to understand the difference between the two.
Yeah.
That's a better way to make the point.
No, a good and a good point to make, and well worded in that regard. I think as I was saying earlier, when we're looking at something like mental health and how that actually sort of does apply to everyday life, again, I think in regards to what we talk about on this podcast and bodybuilding and fitness, is something massive, because on those lines of the ways that these things sort of affect everyday life is that sort of idea of potentially behavioral changes, personality changes. And when we are looking at things like bodybuilding and fitness, that's massive for many reasons. We can look at things like the whole sort of more is better mindset when it sort of comes to people's approach in the gym and with food. The impacts that can potentially have on stuff like poor relationships with food, and things like binging and restricting and stuff. So again, I think for starters, it's important again to go back to the idea of qualification and dealing with this stuff. I think this is probably one that's maybe more so made for the coaches, I guess, because again, more so kind of revolves around client psychology and understanding that people may have experienced these things which may be sort of impacting their behaviors. But it is important to know that these things can have a huge impact on people's behavior. Sometimes there is a really deep underlying root cause, and even though you may not necessarily be able to deal and treat with these as a coach, it's important to understand that these things do exist. It's not always as simple as someone can't stick to a diet because they're lazy. Sometimes there are these things that are actually impacting their behavior on a psychological level, and understanding that these things are there means that, well, for starters, you might even be in a position where you have to refer a client to someone like a psychologist and stuff. Some people will need therapy for these types of things. So it's important to draw awareness to these things for those reasons, because often there is a deep underlying cause in terms of there may be something psychological going on there when you're seeing these behavioral changes, and often that there's an even deeper underlying cause, because often that even links to these things like I briefly mentioned earlier, like trauma and certain experiences which may kind of trigger the whole thing. And again, even though we can't necessarily deal with these things as coaches, it's important to sort of understand their application when it comes to the client.
Yeah, and again, it is important to understand, because something like obesity is probably a pretty good example. Like, first of all, obviously obesity is multifactorial. So, but one of those factors can definitely be emotional trauma, which is why they eat so much. Is that comfort, and that sort of that helps them to deal with the emotional trauma. So it can be very, very complicated. And again, that's why sometimes it's not as simple as just saying, well, eat less, move more, because great, that's everyone understands that. But where's the psychology at? You know, why, if it was so that simple, then everyone would do that. But it's not, because psychologically there's a reason why they're not. And again, understanding that's important. And, you know, don't try to deal with that yourself as a coach. You know, like you said, refer out, and then work alongside that psychologist to help that person. Don't try to do everything when, especially again, when it's just psychology. I mean, if you ask me, physiology is easy compared to psychology. Psychology is so messy, so complicated.
Fair statement.
There's a deep rooted causes for pretty much every behavior that we have. And do you even understand yourself, let alone understand someone else? You know, mm-hmm. As you said, you know, some people will mask that with bodybuilding or trying to gain muscle or trying to lose fat. Some people will mask it because they think, you know, you hear the stories of people maybe getting bullied when they're younger, so they want to get big and strong, and that is a mask for that emotional trauma they went through. Some people want that perfect. some people, some people want that perfect beach body because they think when they have it, that's when they'll be happy, but they won't be, because you need the happiness first. That's why one of my fundamentals and one of my you know, bottom layers as a coach that I try to instill into clients is happiness first. You know, I put health and happiness on the same level, and then everything else above that.
Yeah,
because you won't achieve happiness by, you know, getting this dream body like you think you will. You just won't, because the happiness has to be there already. But again, people try to mask it by, you know, trying to change their physical appearance. But, you know, ask yourself, what's the reason for that? And then starting to really delve deep into that and understanding and recognize the signs is like, you know, if a client says to you, I don't feel like I'm doing enough, then you have to start to read into that more. Like, I mean, don't be wrong, but there will be times when they might just say that and there is no deeper meaning.
It's not always the case, yeah, for sure.
No. But there are times when, and again, be able to differentiate is going to be a key skill, and not an easy skill, but a key skill. So again, delving deep into that, why do they not feel like they're doing enough? Well, is it because they don't feel like they themselves are enough? So they feel like they need to do more in order to satisfy this need to feel like they're working towards what will be their eventual happiness. Again, being able to read that and understand it. And of course, you can't just look at something in isolation. You have to look at alongside other potential behaviors. How's this person around food? How's this person? Where's this person in their life? Where's the relationship at? Where's their work stress at? You know, how is this person acting on a day-to-day basis? And starting to then put together certain pieces of the puzzle, you might get a clearer picture of what this person's experienced psychologically. And again, that's where it can be complicated, it can be messy. You don't want to read into something that isn't there, but you also want to be able to see something that isn't on the surface as well.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people do get into bodybuilding or just trying to improve their body because they psychologically do have issues. And again, just being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of that is a key skill. And then once you do recognize that, that's when you go, okay, suggest maybe you need to get some psychological help. I'm going to keep helping you as a coach, and I'm going to work alongside this person. But I think to really elicit the best results, that probably is a good idea that you go get that extra help.
Yeah. And I think there's a good few things to sort of touch on there, actually, because number one, you sort of mentioned the importance of still being able to work alongside someone else who's also helping the client potentially. I think that's important because, you know, while I completely agree that, you know, getting that beach body and stuff probably won't be the be all and end all to your happiness, that's certainly not to say that, you know, being able to progress yourself and make yourself better physically won't have some, you know, bearing on your happiness. And, you know, then there's always also the old, you know, exercising, endorphins, and that'll make you feel better and stuff like that. So I think there's certainly an element of help that, you know, looking after yourself physically can have on you mentally can definitely be helpful.
Yeah.
But it's definitely important to understand that, you know, those goals probably aren't going to be what ultimately makes you happy. And, you know, as we've said a few times through this, when someone is trying to better themselves, I guess in a sense it's quite obvious, because for you to want to better yourself, you probably have to, at least to a degree, feel like you're not in the best place you can be at the moment. But again, I think that also sort of comes back to the idea of, you know, there being, you know, varying degrees of this, and, you know, potentially, as you said, you may not necessarily even be there. But some people will want to kind of pursue these endeavors, perhaps as almost a bit of a mask of issues that may be, you know, sitting a little bit deeper than you know, the surface. Hey everyone, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more.
If you enjoyed that episode, be sure to check out the latest tidbit here and the latest podcast here. Thanks for watching, guys and girls.